A man, blinded by jealousy to the point of madness, treacherously kills his own brother out in the field. God asks him, "Where is your brother?" And he gives history's coldest answer, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Punishment is severe. The ground will no longer yield to him. He will be a wanderer, an exile on the earth forever. And he's overcome with terror. "Whoever finds me will kill me," he says. Here comes one of the Bible's most shocking, least discussed moments. God places a mysterious mark on this murderer to protect him. So what was this mark? A tattoo? A glow? Or something we've never even considered? And even more striking, centuries later, in one of history's darkest eras, this mark was used for a purpose it was never meant to serve. Today, we're stepping into this forgotten story from Genesis, from the murder to the escape to a mysterious protection, all the way to one of humanity's most dangerous misinterpretations. This story will show you how justice and mercy can exist side by side. Let's begin. Imagine a man who committed the first murder in human history. His brother's blood had soaked into the ground. God himself had directly interrogated him and pronounced a heavy curse upon him. The ground would no longer yield its produce for him, and he would be a wanderer and a fugitive on the earth for the rest of his life. This man, terrified by the weight of his own punishment, says, "Whoever finds me will kill me." And right here comes one of the most unexpected and most debated sentences in the Bible. God places a mark on this fratricide to protect him. A murderer is punished, but also protected. What was this mark? Why did God show mercy while simultaneously executing justice? And how did this mark become one of the darkest misinterpretations in history over the centuries? What surprised me the most while preparing this research was how broad and deliberately ambiguous the word the Bible uses to describe this mark actually is. Over the centuries, everyone from rabbis to church fathers, from modern theologians to historians, tried to fill this gap with their own interpretations. And some of these interpretations, as we will see, led to genuinely dangerous consequences. I also want to state from the outset, this story is not just an ancient murder narrative. It is a timeless examination of one of the most fundamental contradictions in human nature, of how jealousy can turn into violence, and how divine justice can intertwine with unexpected mercy. Even when we look at it today, the observations this 3,000-year-old text makes about human psychology remain surprisingly current. Today, we will enter one of the shortest but most intense narratives in Genesis, the Mark of Cain. We do not avoid difficult questions here. We dive into them. Let us begin. The story begins with Adam and Eve, expelled from the Garden of Eden, and their first two sons. Genesis 4:1-2 tells us that Cain was a worker of the ground, while Abel was a keeper of sheep. Two different professions, two different ways of life. But the story does not stop there, because they both decide to bring an offering to God one day. The text says, "Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the ground. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock, and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard." The Bible does not explicitly state why God accepted Abel's offering and rejected Cain's. This is a gap the text deliberately leaves. Hebrews 11:4 approaches this from a different angle. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. This verse implies that the issue was not just the type of material offered, animal versus plant, but the inner attitude, the faith of the one offering it. That is, perhaps the matter was not what Cain offered, but with what condition of heart he offered it. Some commentators note that Abel specifically chose the firstborn and best fat portions. That is, he offered the most valuable and highest quality he had. Cain's offering is described only as from the fruit of the ground, with no emphasis on first or best. This subtle linguistic difference may imply that Cain's offering was presented more as a formality than with genuine sincerity. Regardless of the reason, the result was devastating for Cain. The text says he became very angry, and his face fell. And right at this point, God speaks directly to Cain, not to punish him, but to give him a warning, an opportunity. Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. This last sentence is one of the most visual descriptions of sin in the Bible. Sin is depicted like an animal crouching at the door, ready to attack. The word choice in the Hebrew text is also interesting. The term used for crouching was frequently employed in ancient Near Eastern literature to describe the posture of a predatory animal waiting for its prey. So God describes sin to Cain not just as an abstract concept, but almost as a living creature waiting for its victim. And God gives Cain a clear choice. He can open this door or resist it. This detail is very important because it shows us that Cain's subsequent action was not a destiny but a conscious decision. God had clearly offered him a way out, a warning, and he chose to ignore it. Cain, despite this warning, seems to have already made his decision. Genesis 4:8. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, "Let us go out to the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. The simplicity of the text makes the atrocity of the event even more striking. No details, no justification are given, just a bare fact. The first murder in human history is committed not against a stranger, but against a brother born of the same parents. And then God comes, with a question similar to the one he asked Adam in the Garden of Eden. "Where is Abel, your brother?" Cain's answer is one of the coldest, most defiant sentences in history. "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Pay attention to this answer. When Adam sinned, at least he hid out of fear, a sign of some shame. Cain, however, lies directly, and then turns the question back with insolence. This is not just a murder, but a complete lack of remorse following it, a state of defiance. The question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" uses the Hebrew word shomer, a fairly common term used to describe someone who guards a flock, a garden, or a property. Cain's choice of this word was likely a deliberate sarcasm, as if he were saying, "Was I supposed to tend my brother like a flock of sheep?" thus belittling his responsibility. Ironically, the rest of the Bible builds exactly this moral framework that answers this question with yes. That we are indeed our brother's and neighbor's keeper becomes a principle emphasized repeatedly. God's answer is chilling. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." The ground itself becomes a witness. The shed blood rises to heaven like a silent cry. This image is a theme that will reappear throughout the Bible. Injustice cannot remain silent. Sooner or later, it will be exposed in some way. Now we come to God's judgment. And this judgment consists of three distinct, interconnected layers. The first layer is a separation from the ground. "And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength." Ground was central to Cain's identity and profession. He was a farmer. And now, this very identity is being taken from him. The ground will no longer obey him. The second layer is physical exile. "You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." The two Hebrew words used, na and nad, mean to wander, to drift aimlessly. Cain would become someone belonging nowhere, constantly in motion, unable to put down roots. The use of these two words together is not coincidental. In ancient Hebrew poetry, this kind of word pairing was a frequent technique to emphasize the intensity and unceasing nature of a condition. So Cain's fate was not just to wander a bit, but to live in constant, unending restlessness. The third layer is perhaps the heaviest: social and relational isolation. Cain would now live outside the safe boundaries of the community, seen as a potential threat by everyone. Think about this. In the ancient world, living outside a community was not just loneliness, but a genuine survival threat. Access to water sources, protection, shared resources, all depended on community membership. Cain's punishment was not just emotional loneliness, but a highly risky situation for survival. Cain's reaction to this triple punishment is perhaps the most human moment in the story. My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. An interesting linguistic note: the Hebrew word Cain uses, avon, can mean both iniquity and punishment. So Cain's sentence could actually be read in two ways. My iniquity is too great to be forgiven, or my punishment is too great to bear. This ambiguity raises an interesting question. Is Cain showing genuine remorse here, or is he just complaining about the heaviness of his own fate? The text does not draw a clear line between these two, and this ambiguity is probably deliberate. Let us pause here and consider Cain's fear. The world at that time must have consisted only of Adam, Eve, and himself, perhaps a few more siblings, but the population was extremely small. So whom was Cain so afraid of? This is a question that has occupied theologians for centuries. Some commentators suggest that the timeline of the text is not strict, and by the time Cain says these words, there were probably many more people, including his own children, grandchildren, descendants of his other siblings living in the world. The genealogies in Genesis show people living for hundreds of years and having many children, so the population could have grown much faster than the linear narrative implies. Another interpretation suggests that Cain's fear was not so much a concrete, tangible threat, but a general anxiety born from the loss of security and loneliness, the fear of living in a world where whoever he meets could be his enemy. Both interpretations are possible, and the text does not give us a definite answer. But whatever Cain's fear was, God's response to it is the real turning point of the story. Another interesting question arises here. Who was Cain's wife? Genesis 4:17 tells us that he knew his wife, but gives no information about her identity. Ancient Jewish commentators suggested she must have been Cain's own sister, because the text mentions no other women, and Genesis 5:4 states that Adam had sons and daughters, meaning, after Abel's death, Adam and Eve had other children. While this may seem disturbing by our modern ethical standards, ancient commentators treated it as a reality of an exceptional era when humanity consisted of a very small population. Later, biblical laws, in Leviticus, would strictly prohibit such marriages, but this was at the very beginning of humanity, before those laws existed. Genesis 4:15 contains one of the most mysterious sentences in the Bible. Then the Lord said to him, "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Notice, the text never explains what this mark was. It simply says a mark, Hebrew ot, was placed. And this word has an extremely broad range of meanings elsewhere in the Bible. The rainbow is a sign. Circumcision is a sign. Even the celestial bodies are described as signs. So this word does not necessarily imply a physical bodily mark. Over the centuries, Jewish and Christian commentators have proposed dozens of different theories to fill this gap. Some early Jewish sources, in the interpretive tradition called Midrash, suggest the mark could have been a letter placed on Cain's forehead, or some kind of glow, a radiance. Some interpretations claim it might have been an animal horn or a strange physical feature. Another tradition suggests the mark was not physical at all, but perhaps a constant trembling, an uncontrollable tremor in Cain's body, an interpretation drawn from the phrase groaning and trembling found in some Greek translations. Another interesting theory is that the mark might have been an animal. Some early commentators suggested God gave Cain a dog or another faithful animal to protect him, providing companionship and physical protection in his lonely exile. Another tradition suggests the mark was actually placed not on Cain himself, but on the surrounding world, for example, a divine agreement that wild animals would not harm him. In medieval Christian art, Cain was often depicted with a mark on his forehead or with horns, but these depictions came not from the text itself, but from the artists' imaginations and the popular legends of their time. This visual tradition caused people to form a specific image in their minds when Cain's mark was mentioned, but this image has no direct connection to the text. It is an example of how art fills a gap left by an ambiguous text with its own interpretation. Most modern theologians prefer to focus on the function of the mark rather than its exact nature. It must have been a kind of public, recognizable sign that everyone could see, conveying the message, "Do not touch this man." Perhaps a tattoo, perhaps an accessory, perhaps simply a known family, clan mark. To be honest, the text itself does not give us a definite answer, and this ambiguity is likely intentional. The author wanted to emphasize not the physical form of the mark, but the divine assurance it carried. Now we come to perhaps the most important and most misunderstood point of this story. This mark was not a punishment, but a protection. Think about this for a moment. God had just cursed a man who committed a murder, but now the same God takes a special measure to protect that man's life. This may seem contradictory at first, but it points to a profound principle that will be repeated throughout the Bible. Justice and mercy do not exclude each other. On the contrary, they operate in an intertwined manner. The phrase, "vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold," is also noteworthy. It means that anyone who harms Cain will face a much heavier punishment than Cain himself committed. So God not only protects Cain, but adds a serious, deterrent warning about his protection. This appears to be an intervention against the blood vengeance tradition common in the ancient world. At that time, avenging a murder was considered the duty of the family or clan, and this often led to unending cycles of violence. Here, God seems to want to break this cycle from the start. Cain was punished, but the execution of this punishment would not be left to human hands. This interestingly points to another institution that will develop later in the Bible: cities of refuge. Described in Numbers 35, these were places where a person who had accidentally killed someone could seek refuge from avengers. Cain's mark might be the oldest, most primitive form of this idea: the restriction of individual vengeance, the idea that justice must be separated from personal anger. The system of cities of refuge also includes an interesting detail. The person seeking refuge had to stay there until the death of the high priest. If he left the city before that time, the protection was removed. Some commentators suggest this system carries the same logic as the basic principle in Cain's story. Justice is not completely abolished, but uncontrolled. Instant execution by human anger is not permitted. This balance, neither complete impunity nor instant execution, seems to be a principle at the heart of the Bible's understanding of justice. In this context, Cain's story can be said to carry the seeds of the first principle of fair trial in human history. Even a person who commits a crime has the right to protection from arbitrary, uncontrolled violence. Punishment must be applied in a measured way, within a divine or institutional framework, not left to the mercy of individual anger. It is also possible to see the reflection of this principle in modern legal systems. Today, in almost every country, personal revenge is illegal. The punishment for a crime is left not to the victim or their family, but to an impartial judicial process. This means that a principle first appearing in Cain's story thousands of years ago has become one of the cornerstones of today's legal systems. Justice must be separated from personal anger and placed within an impartial framework. I must be honest here and address a very sensitive issue. Some interpretations of what this mark was have been historically misused for extremely harmful, racist purposes. In the 19th century and beyond, some American and European writers identified Cain's mark with dark skin color, using it to religiously justify slavery and racial discrimination. This interpretation had no basis in the text itself. It was a completely invented distortion created later to serve political and economic interests. The text never states the color, race, or hereditary nature of the mark. This connection was imposed on the text from the outside by a malicious reading. To briefly touch on the historical origin of this distortion, during this period, some circles wanting to defend the slavery system were searching for evidence of racial hierarchy in the Bible. Cain's story, containing a punished and marked figure, was seen as suitable material for this purpose, completely taken out of context and reinterpreted to serve a contemporary racist agenda. Similar distortions were made for other passages in Genesis, like the narrative of Ham's curse, and such interpretations are not taken seriously in modern academic and theological circles. Why do I emphasize this? Because the aim of this channel is not only to tell interesting stories, but also to be honest about how the Bible can be misinterpreted and misused. The misuse of a text does not mean the text itself is evil, but knowing this history helps us approach the same text with more careful, critical eyes when reading it today. In modern academic and theological circles, this racial interpretation is almost universally rejected and considered a historical distortion. Cain's story does not end here. Genesis 4:16-1-7. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When Cain was building a city, he named the city after his son Enoch. There is a striking irony here. God had told Cain, "You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, constantly moving, unable to put down roots anywhere." But the first thing Cain does is the complete opposite: found a city, build a permanent settlement. Some commentators read this as a kind of rebellion against his own fate, as if he were trying to cancel the rootlessness punishment ordained by God with his own hands, by human power. Others read it more neutrally. Perhaps being a wanderer did not mean being completely non-settled, but merely being deprived of safe, permanent land ownership. Another interesting reading of this city-building attempt is this: perhaps Cain was building a city precisely to escape what he feared, being alone, vulnerable. In the ancient world, cities were primarily founded for defense. Walls, gates, communal security structures protected individuals from external threats. If Cain truly lived with the fear, "Whoever finds me will kill me," building a city could be a highly logical, human response to this fear. Just as God's mark was a protection, the city he built was another kind of security measure. Cain's lineage also develops interestingly. Among his descendants are counted Jubal, father of nomadic pastoralism, Jubal, father of music, the lyre and pipe, and Tubal-Cain, a forger of metalworking. So, ironically, humanity's first great cultural and technological advancements come from the line of the first murderer. This is a complex, layered message the Bible gives about human nature. Sin and creativity, destruction and progress, can be intertwined within the same lineage. This detail also offers an interesting perspective on the origin of technological and cultural development in the ancient world. The text neither sanctifies nor curses these skills. It simply shows that even a lineage estranged from God could make real, lasting contributions to humanity. This might be a lesson reminding us that divine grace and human ability are not directly proportional to moral perfection. In Cain's lineage, a few generations later, we see perhaps the darkest reflection of this part of the story: Lamech. In Genesis 4:23-4, Lamech calls out to his wives, "I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me." If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. Compare these lines with God's promise to Cain. God had promised sevenfold vengeance to protect Cain. This was a principle of protection, of limitation. But Lamech distorts this principle to justify his own violence, even exaggerating it by raising it to 77-fold. Cain was terrified and afraid after committing his murder. Lamech, however, tells of his murder like a boastful song. This contrast is not just a comparison between two individuals. It provides a striking example of how moral decay progresses across generations. Cain's sin at least came with a pang of conscience, a fear. He still knew what he did was wrong. By the time we get to Lamech, violence is no longer a source of shame, but of pride. This is a warning example of how a society's sensitivity to violence can become blunted within a few generations. The text does not explicitly judge this, but by placing Lamech's song next to Cain's terror, it gives the reader the opportunity to recognize this contrast. This is also the first example of how a divine principle can be turned into a weapon, just as the mark was later distorted for racist purposes. Here, too, the original divine message is reversed by human hands. This is an important warning from the story. Even a well-intentioned, protective principle can serve the opposite purpose in the wrong hands. Interestingly, the Bible itself never explicitly narrates Cain's final fate. The text tells us he built a city and left a lineage, but gives no direct information about how he died or what happened to his punishment in the end. This contrasts with the clear closure the Bible provides for many other important figures, like the death of Moses, for example. This silence has been attempted to be filled by various traditions over the centuries. Some Jewish Midrash traditions tell that Cain was finally killed by his own descendant, Lamech, accidentally during a hunt, a story where Lamech, who was blind, had his young helper shoot an arrow at Cain, thinking he was an animal. This narrative is not in the canonical Bible text. It is a product of the later Jewish interpretive tradition. But interestingly, it completes the theme of cyclical justice in the story. Someone from Cain's line eventually becomes the one who kills him, just as Cain killed his own brother. Among Orthodox Christian traditions, there are also some views that Cain died in the flood. That is, his end came with the same great destruction as the rest of humanity. But again, this is an interpretation developed later, not explicitly written in the text itself. This silence itself could be meaningful. Perhaps the author of Genesis deliberately left Cain's final fate ambiguous, wanting the reader to focus on the main message. The important thing is not exactly how Cain died, but the unexpected mercy God showed him and the complex legacy his lineage left to human history. This is actually an approach consistent with the general narrative style of the Bible. The authors generally preferred to focus on the theological essence of the story, rather than filling in every detail that might arouse curiosity. How Cain died was not necessary for the moral message of the story, so the text may have deliberately left this gap open, leaving it to the curiosity and imagination of future generations. So what does this story mean for us today? Perhaps none of us has physically killed our brother, but the emotional journey Cain experienced, jealousy, anger of rejection, the sin crouching at the door, is familiar to all of us. Think about it. Cain's tragedy did not start with a single momentary outburst of anger. First came rejection, then anger, then a conscious choice despite God's clear warning. At every stage, there was a way out, but Cain chose to progress each time. This reminds us that destructive behaviors rarely emerge suddenly. They usually form through the accumulation of small, neglected moments. Modern psychology actually confirms this pattern. Violent behaviors are mostly not sudden, inexplicable outbursts, but are usually the result of accumulated, ignored small signals over time. Thousands of years ago, Cain's story captured this human reality in an extremely simple yet profound way. If anger is not noticed and addressed in its first moment, it can become a danger waiting at the door. But the story also carries hope. Even after his worst mistake, Cain was not completely abandoned. God punished him, but did not destroy him. Moreover, he even took special measures to protect him. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the story. Divine justice does not mean completely ruining a person. Even the gravest mistakes can sometimes meet with unexpected mercy. Perhaps there is a mistake, a relationship, a past in your life that you think is beyond repair. Cain's story challenges this thought. It shows the possibility that even the greatest mistake is not entirely final, that there can still be a future, still a life continuing. The Mark of Cain teaches us three things. First, sin often waits silently at the door, and it always presents us with a moment of choice. The problem is whether we notice this moment. Second, divine justice and divine mercy can operate not as opposites, but as complementary forces. Third, even the best-intentioned principles can be distorted by human hands, just as the sevenfold vengeance principle was distorted by Lamech, and the mark itself was distorted by racists throughout history, which is why it is always important to read texts carefully and honestly. I want to add one more thought. Perhaps the most striking thing about this story is how human it is. Jealousy, rejection, anger, regret, fear. All of these are emotions we still recognize today, even though they were written thousands of years ago. Cain is not a distant historical figure, but rather a mirror of a potential vulnerability we all carry within us. And precisely because of this, that unexpected mercy shown to him carries a glimmer of hope for us as well. If this video made you think, write Mark in the comments. And don't forget to mention what you think this mark might have been. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and send this to someone who might be curious about this story. Because sometimes even the heaviest punishment can carry within it an unexpected mercy. Every week on this channel, we delve into the least discussed and most misunderstood stories of the Bible. Let me know in the comments which story you would like us to explore together next time. See you in the next video.